Hello everyone, my name is Kristina Islo and I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and as well a member of NANOGrav's detection working group. And I'm talking to you in order to give you a broad overview of exactly what it is we do within this group. So specifically the kind of gravitational wave searches we perform on the data, the statistical analysis that we use, as well as some of our recent results. So it might seem a little bit strange that we have a working group dedicated to gravitational wave detection, when in fact that is the goal of the entire collaboration. And the reason for this is our pulsar timing data set is large. We only have the one data set. The signal that we are looking for is very small. There's lots of uncertainties in the gravitational wave model parameters, and some of those parameters are degenerate or covariant with other parameters, and so it's really vital that we have robust data analysis techniques that enable us to confidently make statements about what signals are or are not present in the data and assign a degree of belief to those statements. So we don't want to go around making spurious claims of detection. We have to be careful and methodical when conducting the search. So that requires a dedicated team of people. So NANOGrav is combing its data for two different types of gravitational wave signals, deterministic and stochastic, and these manifest themselves in slightly different ways in our data, and we have to go about searching for them in slightly different ways. So the first type is deterministic, and these are signals that in theory we can precisely know. So we characterize them in terms of amplitude and phase, and we can write them down as functions of time. In practice, these functions might be difficult to uncover, but in theory, we can know these things if we know everything about the source and everything about how that gravitational wave radiation propagates through the universe. An example of this would be a continuous wave from a single inspiraling supermassive black hole binary. So this is at the stage in the merger where the black holes are orbiting one another at a fairly constant frequency and at a fairly wide and constant orbital separation. So they're slowly losing energy via interactions with their environment and gravitational wave radiation, but over a single pulsar observation period, this frequency and this separation remain fairly constant. So on the left is a plot showing just how such a continuous wave would appear in pulsar timing data. You can see it imprinting this sort of sinusoidal structure with a single gravitational wave frequency on the residuals as the gravitational wave stretches and squeezes the space between Earth and the pulsar. And another type of deterministic signal that we're searching for is called a burst with memory. So continuous waves, I said, were coming from the inspiral stage of the merger. And a burst with memory is radiation that occurs at the moment of coalescence. So this is an effect predicted by general relativity and can be thought simply as a permanent deformation of space-time moving outwards at the speed of light. So basically a single gravitational wavefront propagating out. We're also investigating the presence of a stochastic signal. So this is a signal that contains some number of random processes. And what that means is we can't assign a precise amplitude or phase or frequency to this signal. We can only access information about it through its statistical properties, such as the variance. For example, our universe doesn't just have one supermassive black hole binary, and it doesn't have just a few that are all emitting continuous waves that we can potentially measure. There are many, many binaries. It would be impossible for us to track exactly how each one of those is evolving and the type of radiation it's emitting in the form of gravitational waves. There's too many unknowns, and many of those signals wouldn't even be strong enough to detect, even if we're able to characterize our noise incredibly well. So all of those unresolvable signals together superimpose to form a gravitational wave background that has some randomness inherent to it. And this is our stochastic signal. How do we search for these signals? Well, there's lots of uncertainties as far as the type of signal that we're searching for in our data. And theoretically, we can pare those down a little bit, but we have to make sure to account for these uncertainties and characterize them. So that means that we need to use statistical analysis. And we only have the one single data realization, just the one 12.5-year pulsar timing data set. We don't have multiple different data sets that we can compare and use that comparison to then distill out the gravitational wave signal that could be in all of them. So what we need is a way to test multiple different hypotheses, different models, for all the range of uncertainties that we have, and recover meaningful information about how probable those models and those model signals are. And the way that we do this is with Bayesian statistics. I think it's helpful when describing Bayesian statistics to describe also what it's not. So without going into a lot of math, just very basically, there's two schools of thought and two different sort of statistical philosophies, those being Frequentist and Bayesian. And these differ primarily in how they define probability. So according to the Frequentist definition of probability, only repeatable random events, like the result of flipping a coin, have probabilities. And these probabilities are equal to the long-term frequency of occurrence of the events in question. So frequentists don't attach probabilities to hypotheses or to any fixed but unknown values in general. And in contrast, we have Bayesian statistics, which uses probabilities to represent the uncertainty in any event or hypothesis. So in this case, it's perfectly acceptable to assign probabilities to non-repeatable events. In our case, we just have the one data set. We can't repeat the experiment over and over and over again, so we need to use Bayesian statistics. An example of this would be let's say that you are trying to measure the average height of American men, let's just say. And so a frequentist would go about this by saying, all right, well, I know that there is some mean value, and I know that it's fixed, it's not random. Therefore, I can't assign a probability to that mean being equal to a certain value or being less than or greater than some value. The most that you can do is collect data from a sample of the population and estimate its mean as the value which is most consistent with the data. And a Bayesian would look at this differently. So they would say that, yes, the mean is fixed and has an unknown value, but there's no problem in representing the uncertainty in that mean value probabilistically. So I'll do so by defining a probability distribution over the possible values of the mean and use sample data to update that distribution. And so when we search for the parameters of signals that could be in our data, we use prior knowledge, which we have determined theoretically or observationally, to apply that sample data or that prior knowledge. And that, with Bayes' theorem, enables us to compute credible regions for parameters. So we use this Bayes' theorem here, and the prior probability, this p of some parameter, that is how likely going into your experiment you think one particular type of parameter value will be. You can then calculate a likelihood, which is the probability of you measuring your data set given that parameter is true. And then there's this normalization factor, which we call the evidence. And via this theorem, we can get what's called a posterior probability, or a distribution of probabilities for a specific parameter value given the data. Here's an example of that. So one particular parameter that we're interested in, and we're interested in what our data can tell us about what this parameter value takes, is the gravitational wave background amplitude. And so here you can see an example of a prior that we would place on this, just a Gaussian prior, which we can use previous knowledge to set. So we enter this into our pipeline along with the pulsar timing data, and it goes through this likelihood calculation and spits out these posterior distributions, which are the regions that we believe the actual value of the parameter to lie in. With Bayesian analysis, not only can we form posteriors, but I also briefly mentioned previously that we can compute odds ratios, and this is how we can quantitatively measure detection significance. And in the absence of a detection, we can still use these posteriors to make informative statements by placing 95% upper limits on parameter values that can then lead us to infer different types of astrophysics. We can then feed back into our model via priors, and that will enable us to get narrower and narrower posteriors and hone in on what these actual values are and what is actually present in our data. So within this working group, we have lots of models to test. We have lots of pipeline instances to run, and we need lots and lots of person power. So if you're at all interested, let us know and we'll get you started.